The wedding was flawless. Every detail curated, every guest vetted. Victoria Hale stood at the center of it all, composed, radiant, untouchable. Then she spotted him near the back of the room. Daniel Brooks, a low-level employee in a plain suit, completely out of place among the city's elite. She didn't hesitate. One signal to security, and he was escorted out without a word. Quiet, unhurried, like it never happened. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked twice. 3 days later, Victoria would learn that the man she'd just removed owned the bank, financing her entire company. Victoria Hale did not leave things to chance. Not in business, not in her personal life, and certainly not on her wedding day. The venue had been selected 14 months in advance, a restored 19th century estate on the edge of the city, with vaulted ceilings, sculpted gardens, and a guest list that read like a directory of the city's most influential names. Every table arrangement had been reviewed twice, every catering detail signed off personally. The florals had been replaced the morning of because one centerpiece was 2 inches off center. That was simply how Victoria operated, with precision and with complete control. She had built Hale Consolidated from a mid-sized logistics firm into one of the fastest-growing commercial development companies in the region. She had done it through relentless, focused, strategic partnerships and an instinctive ability to read a room and know exactly who mattered and who didn't. At 41, Victoria wore her success the way other women wore jewelry, not to impress, but because it was simply part of her. It suited her. It fit. The wedding was everything she had designed it to be. By early evening, the main hall was warm with low light and the sound of a string quartet playing underneath the controlled hum of conversation. Glasses clinked. Laughter landed soft and measured. The right people said the right things. Her new husband, Gregory, moved through the room with ease, charming, well-connected, exactly the kind of man who looked at home in this kind of space. Victoria moved differently. She observed. She catalogued. She remained at the center of the room without ever appearing to try. It was during a brief exchange with Marcus Ellison, a senior partner at one of the city's largest investment firms and one of Hale Consolidated's most important allies, that her attention shifted. Ellison was mid-sentence about a new infrastructure bill when his gaze drifted slightly to the left of her shoulder. The shift was subtle, but Victoria caught it immediately. She turned, following his line of sight, without making it obvious. Standing near the far edge of the hall, not far from one of the service corridors, was Daniel Brooks. He was holding a glass of water, not champagne. His suit was dark and clean, but unmistakably off the rack, the kind that didn't quite sit right at the shoulders. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He wasn't trying to. He simply stood there, watching the room the way a person watches something that doesn't entirely belong to them. Victoria recognized him. Daniel worked in the Operational Analysis Division, one of perhaps 60 people in that department, one of hundreds in the company overall. She had seen his name on internal reports, and his face in passing exactly once, maybe twice. He was not someone she had cause to think about. He was by every visible measure unremarkable. Ellison's voice came back to her low and casual. "Is that one of your people?" The question was not hostile. It was the kind of thing a man like Ellison asked with genuine neutrality, the way someone might ask about an unfamiliar painting on a wall. But Victoria understood what the question really meant. She understood the subtext of that kind of event, where every person present was a signal. Where who you allowed in the room said something about who you were. A man in an ill-fitting suit, standing alone near the back with no conversation and no context. That was not a signal she wanted attached to this evening. "He's an employee," she said, keeping her voice even. "He shouldn't be here." Ellison smiled the way powerful men smile when something has been handled before they need to ask twice, and returned to his point about the infrastructure bill. Victoria listened, nodded at the right moments, and waited until Ellison's attention was fully back on his own thoughts, before she caught the eye of one of her security coordinators across the room. The signal was minimal, a slight tilt of her chin toward where Daniel was standing. The coordinator understood immediately. She didn't watch what happened next. That wasn't how she did things. She redirected her attention back to Ellis and asked a pointed question about bond structures, and let the evening continue the way it was supposed to. What she registered in her peripheral awareness was that it was over in under 2 minutes. No raised voices, no scene. Just a brief, quiet exchange near the edge of the hall, followed by Daniel Brooks walking toward the exit with the security coordinator 2 steps behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He simply left as cleanly and without resistance as if he had been expecting it. Victoria filed the moment away the way she filed away anything minor and concluded. It happened. It was handled. It was done. The rest of the evening moved exactly as planned. The dinner service was precise. The speeches were brief and well delivered, and by the time the final guests made their way out into the night, Victoria could say with complete confidence that the event had been exactly what she intended it to be. Flawless, controlled, a statement. She did not think about Daniel Brooks again that night. What she didn't know, what she had no reason to consider, was that Daniel Brooks had received his invitation through the company's internal event distribution, a standard procedure for significant corporate milestones that extended courtesy invitations to all full-time staff. He had almost declined. He was not a man who sought out rooms like that, rooms full of noise and performance, and people angling toward each other for advantage. But something had brought him anyway, a quiet curiosity perhaps, or simply the fact that he had nothing pressing that evening, and the venue was connected to a property he had a professional interest in knowing more about. He had planned to stay no more than an hour. He had stayed less than 30 minutes. The security coordinator had been professional. There was no scene, no raised voice, no physical contact. The man had simply appeared at Daniel's side, leaned close, and said in a low voice that there had been a guest list discrepancy, and they would need him to step outside to resolve it. Daniel had looked at the man for a moment, the kind of look that takes in a situation completely and without drama, and then he had set down his glass of water on the nearest surface, straightened his jacket, and walked out. He did not ask to speak to anyone. He did not request an explanation. He simply left, and as the heavy doors of the estate closed behind him, he stood for a moment in the night air, looking out at the long drive lined with cars that cost more than most people's annual salary, and he decided something quietly and without fanfare. By the time Victoria Hale was cutting her wedding cake, Daniel Brooks was already home, and whatever he decided in that moment on the steps of that estate, he kept entirely to himself. The morning after the wedding, a courier delivered a curated summary of the evening's press coverage to Victoria's home office. 3 lifestyle publications had already run digital features. The photographs were immaculate. The coverage was exactly what she had aimed for, polished, aspirational, undeniable. She read through it over coffee, made a note to send thank you messages to 2 journalists, and moved on. Her company's next phase was already in motion. Hale Consolidated had spent the better part of the previous year positioning for a major expansion, new commercial developments across 3 districts, all of it contingent on a substantial capital injection. The financing had been structured through Sterling Crest Bank, one of the region's most established financial institutions. The terms had taken months to negotiate. The approval had come through 6 weeks before the wedding. Everything was aligned. Everything was moving exactly as it was supposed to move. Victoria had built her company on that kind of certainty, the certainty that came from doing the work, knowing the numbers, and trusting the structure she had put in place. She had no reason on the morning after her wedding to feel anything other than forward momentum. She had no reason to think about a man in a plain suit who had stood quietly at the edge of her reception and then disappeared without a word. She had no reason to think about him at all. That was the first mistake. Not the only one, but the one that set everything else in motion. Not because of what she had done exactly, but because of what she had assumed. She had assumed that removing someone from a room was a small thing, a maintenance decision, the way you'd clear a table that was cluttering the space. She had assumed the matter was closed because she had stopped thinking about it. But some doors don't close just because you stop looking at them. The first sign appeared 9 days after the wedding. Victoria's legal team had submitted the final tranche of documentation to Sterling Crest Bank on a Tuesday, a routine filing the kind they had done 3 times already in the preceding months without issue. By Friday, a response came back requesting supplemental materials. Not a rejection, not a flag, just a request. Additional verification on 2 of the development parcels. Updated revenue projections for the 3rd district. A resubmission of the environmental compliance reports this time, with notarized attachments that had not previously been required. Victoria's head of finance, a methodical man named Robert Crane, brought the request to her directly. He framed it carefully the way people frame things, when they want to appear calm, but aren't entirely. "It's unusual," he said, "but not impossible. Banks tighten their internal review processes from time to time. It could be nothing." Victoria told him to compile everything and resubmit within 48 hours. She moved on to the next item on her agenda. The supplemental materials were submitted in full ahead of the bank's stated deadline. The acknowledgement came back promptly, and then nothing happened for 11 days. Crane sent a follow-up inquiry. The response was polite and opaque. The review was ongoing. Additional internal assessments were being conducted. A timeline would be communicated as soon as it was available. Victoria read the email twice. The language was standard. The tone was professional. But there was something underneath it that didn't sit right, a quality she had learned to recognize in negotiations, the particular texture of language being used to delay, without saying so directly. She told Crane to escalate. He did. The escalation produced a meeting request for the following week, which was then rescheduled to the week after that. When a second follow-up produced a 3rd rescheduling, Victoria stopped waiting for her team to manage it and made the call herself. She reached the bank's senior relationship manager, a woman named Patricia Donovan, who had been her primary contact throughout the financing process. The conversation was cordial and uninformative. Patricia Donovan used phrases like comprehensive review cycle and standard procedural alignment, and nothing to be concerned about at this stage. Victoria recognized the shape of a professional runaround when she was inside one. She thanked Patricia and ended the call. That evening, she sat in her home office with the full financing file spread across the desk and went through every line herself. The terms were solid. The collateral was in order. The company's financial position was stronger than it had been at the start of negotiations. Nothing in those documents gave a bank reasonable cause to stall a disbursement this far into an approved process. Whatever was causing the delay was not in the paperwork. The following Monday, Victoria arrived at Sterling Crest Bank's regional headquarters for what had been characterized as a preliminary alignment meeting, a phrase that told her exactly nothing. She brought Crane and her legal counsel, a composed and precise woman named Helen Marsh. The 3 of them were shown to a conference room on the 14th floor. The room was large, deliberately so, with a long table and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. It was the kind of room designed to remind you of scale of how much space the other side of the table occupied relative to your own. They waited for 7 minutes. Then the door opened. 2 people entered first, a bank associate and a compliance officer, both carrying materials, both moving with the particular efficiency of people who have been briefed. Victoria registered them and dismissed them in the same motion. And then, the 3rd person stepped into the room, and something in Victoria's chest did a thing she hadn't experienced in a very long time. It locked. Just for a second, but completely. Daniel Brooks set his folder on the table, pulled out the chair directly across from her, and sat down. He was dressed differently than she had seen him before, not dramatically, but precisely. The suit was well cut and understated, the kind that didn't announce itself. He looked exactly as calm as he had looked the night he was escorted out of her reception. He looked like a man who had been expecting this meeting for some time. "Ms. Hale, daughter White," he said, and his voice was level and professional, with nothing in it that could be called hostile or satisfied. "Thank you for coming in. Victoria's legal counsel, Helen Marsh, leaned slightly forward and addressed the room. Could someone clarify the capacity in which Mr. Brooks is participating today? Our understanding was that this meeting would be with the bank's senior lending division. The compliance officer responded without hesitation. Mr. Brooks is the authorized representative of Whitmore Capital Group, the principal investment entity, with controlling interest in Sterling Crest Bank. He has full decision-making authority over the matters being discussed today. The room didn't change. The city outside the windows didn't shift. But something in Victoria's understanding of the situation restructured itself quickly, and without mercy, the way a building settles after the ground beneath it moves. She had read the ownership structure of Sterling Crest Bank before entering the financing agreement. She always did. She knew it was held through a series of institutional funds. She had not traced those funds to their source. She had not seen a reason to. The bank was established reputable, and the terms had been favorable. That had been enough. It had not been enough. She looked at Daniel Brooks across the length of that table and understood, without needing anyone to explain it further, exactly what she was looking at. The man she had signaled security to remove from her wedding reception was the man who held controlling authority over the institution, financing her company's entire expansion. He had been sitting in her operational analysis department, not because he needed the work, but because he moved through spaces the way water moves, finding its own level, collecting information without drawing attention. And she had looked at him, at his off-the-rack suit, and his unremarkable posture, and his glass of water in a room full of champagne. And she had decided in under 10 seconds that he didn't belong. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Daniel Brooks conducted it, the way someone conducts a thing they have thought through carefully, methodically, without visible emotion, without a single reference to what had happened at the wedding. He walked through the bank's concerns about the financing structure, questions about the valuation methodology on the 3rd District parcels, inconsistencies in how the projected revenue timelines aligned with current market conditions, and a need for a more detailed assessment of the company's debt service coverage ratios under stress scenarios. Every point was specific, documented, and technically legitimate. Nothing he raised was fabricated. Everything could be defended, but it would take time and resources to defend it properly. And time was exactly what Victoria did not have. When the meeting concluded, Daniel gathered his materials, thanked the room, and left with the same economy of movement that had characterized everything she had seen him do. He didn't linger. He didn't look at her differently than he looked at anyone else in the room. He simply finished and left. Helen Marsh waited until the elevator doors had closed before she said anything. "He's not wrong about the stress scenarios," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The valuations on the 3rd District are aggressive. We knew that going in." Victoria said nothing. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby and watched the floor numbers descend. The weeks that followed moved in a way that Victoria was not accustomed to, not forward, but sideways, grinding, resistant. The bank's formal review process was now officially underway, which meant the disbursement was frozen. Crane worked with the external auditors to prepare the additional documentation. Helen Marsh coordinated with the bank's legal team on the procedural requirements. Victoria managed the external-facing communications, keeping her language steady and her messaging controlled, telling her board that the delay was a standard review cycle and that the fundamentals of the expansion remained sound. What she didn't tell the board, what she was still working out herself, was that 2 of her development partners had started asking questions she hadn't been asked before. One of them, a firm she had worked with across 3 prior projects, sent a message through their legal counsel requesting updated financial disclosures. It was framed as routine. It was not routine. Partners didn't request updated disclosures mid-process unless something had reached them that made them uncertain. Something had reached them. The contractor lined up for the 1st District build quietly pushed their mobilization date back by 3 weeks, citing pending contract clarity. The vendor responsible for materials procurement for the 2nd District requested a meeting to discuss payment schedule modifications. These things happened at the edges, not at the center, the way structural damage often begins. Not where you're looking, but at the joints, the connectors, the places where different pieces of a system meet each other and depend on each other to hold. Victoria held everything she could hold. She worked 16-hour days and made herself available in every room where her presence was needed. She answered questions directly and without visible strain. She did not let anyone in her organization see her calculating, which she was doing, constantly running through scenarios, mapping outcomes, identifying which pieces she could afford to lose and which ones she could not. And in the quieter parts of those long days, a different kind of calculation began, one that had nothing to do with debt-service ratios or valuation methodologies. It was less precise and more uncomfortable. She kept returning to the conference room on the 14th floor to the moment Daniel Brooks had walked in and sat down across from her. She kept returning to the expression on his face, or rather, the absence of one. There had been no satisfaction in it, no performance of power. He had simply been present the way he had been present at the reception, the way she suspected he was present in most situations, completely, and without needing anyone to acknowledge it. She had looked at him at her wedding and made a decision in seconds. She had not asked who he was. She had not considered that her own guest list, distributed through internal company channels, might have been extended to someone whose position she didn't fully understand. She had looked at the surface, the suit, the solitude, the absence of the right social signals, and she had acted on what she saw, and she had been certain, in the way she was usually certain, about things, that the decision was correct. That certainty was no longer available to her. The call came on a Thursday morning, 3.5 weeks after the meeting at the bank. It was Patricia Donovan, the relationship manager, but her tone was different this time, less managed, more precise. Sterling Crest was formally initiating a restructuring review of the financing agreement. The disbursement would remain suspended, pending the outcome of that review. The review would assess whether the terms of the original agreement remained appropriate, given the current conditions of Hale Consolidated's financial position. Depending on the outcome, modifications to the agreement structure might be required, modifications that could include revised equity arrangements. Victoria asked Patricia Donovan to clarify what revised equity arrangements meant in practical terms. Patricia Donovan said, in the measured and unhurried language of someone reading from a prepared statement, that in certain restructuring scenarios, the bank's stakeholders might require a direct governance position within the borrowing entity as a condition of continued financing. Victoria understood what that meant. It meant that if the review didn't go in her favor, Daniel Brooks, through Whitmore Capital Group, through Sterling Crest Bank, through the layered institutional architecture she had not traced to its source, could end up with a seat at the table of her own company. The company she had built, the company she controlled, the company that was in every meaningful sense the structure of her life. She thanked Patricia Donovan and ended the call. For a long moment she sat at her desk and looked at nothing in particular. The city moved outside her window. Somewhere in the building below her, staff were working through the day. Everything continued the way things continue, regardless of what is collapsing inside it. She had spent 20 years building something that no one could take from her. She had been meticulous and disciplined and relentlessly forward-facing. She had made herself into someone who didn't make mistakes she couldn't recover from. And yet, here she was. 3 weeks out from a wedding, she had controlled down to the last floral arrangement, sitting with the distinct and humiliating awareness that the mistake she hadn't seen coming had been made in under 10 seconds, in a room full of people who weren't watching over a man. She had decided didn't matter. She requested the meeting herself, not through Crane, not through Helen Marsh, not through any of the layered channels that people in her position typically use to avoid the discomfort of direct contact. She called Daniel Brooks's office at Whitmore Capital Group and asked his assistant for 30 minutes of his time. The assistant said she would check. 40 minutes later, the confirmation came back, Thursday at 10 in the morning, the same building, a different floor. Victoria did not bring her legal team. She told Helen Marsh the meeting was informational. She told Crane she would update him afterward. She drove herself. The office on the 22nd floor looked nothing like the conference room below. It was smaller than she expected, functional rather than performative, with bookshelves that held actual books and a desk that faced the window rather than the door. Daniel was already seated when she was shown in. He stood briefly, gestured to the chair across from him, and sat back down. There was no associate in the room, no compliance officer, no one taking notes. He waited for her to begin. Victoria had thought about how to open this conversation for 4 days. She had drafted versions of it in her head during the early morning hours when the rest of the household was quiet, and the only honest thinking she could do happened in the dark. She had considered the strategic angle, the acknowledgement of a process misstep framed around business continuity. She had considered the neutral angle, a professional conversation about the review timeline and what it would take to satisfy the bank's concerns. Both of those versions felt clean and manageable. Both of those versions, she had concluded, were wrong. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not in connection with the financing, separately, for what happened at the reception." Daniel looked at her steadily. He didn't respond immediately, and the silence wasn't awkward. It was simply his, the way everything about him seemed to occupy space without asking permission. "I saw you standing at the back of the room," Victoria continued, "and I made a decision about who you were in about 10 seconds. I didn't know your name at the time, not really. I knew you worked in the company. I didn't know anything else. And I decided based on how you looked and where you were standing that you didn't belong in that room." She kept her voice even, but didn't make it cold. "I signaled security and had you removed, in front of other guests, without speaking to you directly, without explaining anything, without—" She stopped, restarted. It was a bad decision, not because of anything that followed. It was a bad decision on its own terms, and I should have known it when I made it. Daniel let her finish. He didn't lean forward or backward. He held the same quality of attention she had seen in him across the conference table, complete, unhurried, without performance. "I appreciate that," he said, finally. His voice was the same as it had been in every interaction she'd had with him, level without inflection, that could be read as either warm or cold. Genuinely. He didn't add anything to soften the word or expand it into something larger than it was. Victoria held the moment. She had expected more, a reciprocal gesture, a concession, something that would indicate the ledger was now balanced. What she got instead was exactly what he said. Nothing more, nothing less. "I'm not here to negotiate the review," she said. "I understand the process has to run." Daniel nodded once. "It does. The concerns we raised are real. The third district valuation is the primary issue. The revenue projections were built on absorption rates that the current market doesn't support. That needs to be addressed properly before disbursement can proceed. That's separate from anything personal." "I understand," Victoria said. "The review will be conducted the same way it would be conducted for any borrower in this position," Daniel said. "The outcome will reflect what the numbers say, not what happened at your reception." She hadn't come asking for that assurance, but she recognized sitting across from him in that quiet office that she had needed to hear it, not because it changed the situation, but because it told her something about the kind of man she was dealing with. He wasn't trading on what had happened. He wasn't holding it at arm's length, either pretending it didn't exist. He was simply keeping the two things separate, which was either the most professionally disciplined thing she had ever witnessed, or the most quietly principled, and she wasn't entirely sure which. She thanked him and stood to leave. At the door, she stopped without fully turning around. "How long have you been with the company?" she asked. "With Whitmore?" "Long enough," Daniel said. She nodded and left. The restructuring review ran for another 3 weeks. Victoria's team worked through the documentation in full. The valuations were revised, the revenue projections remodeled with updated market data, the stress scenarios built out to the bank's specifications. Crane did some of the best work she had seen from him in years, and she told him so directly, which was not something she had made a habit of doing before. Helen Marsh renegotiated 2 of the covenant structures and came back with terms that were tighter than the original agreement, but defensible. They were not the terms Victoria had wanted. They were the terms the situation had produced, and she accepted them without attempting to reframe them as a victory. The disbursement was reinstated. The equity arrangements that Patricia Donovan had referenced the governance position the seat at the table did not materialize. What came instead was an enhanced monitoring agreement, quarterly financial reporting to the bank's stakeholders, and a revised timeline for the 3rd District development that aligned with more conservative market projections. Hale Consolidated would move forward. Slower than planned, with more oversight than Victoria was accustomed to, but forward. Her board was briefed on the full resolution. The room received it professionally, as boards do, asking the right questions and filing the right concerns. Marcus Ellison, who sat on an advisory committee connected to one of the development partners, sent her a brief message afterward. The matter had been handled well. She appreciated the message and didn't entirely believe it, which was, she recognized, probably the correct response. The expansion proceeded. The 1st District broke ground 6 weeks after the financing was reinstated. The contractor who had pushed back their mobilization date returned to the original schedule. The vendor renegotiation was resolved without significant loss. Things moved again the way things move when the obstacle has been cleared, not as if nothing happened, but forward. Nonetheless, Victoria noticed in the months that followed that something in the way she moved through her own organization had shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no restructuring of protocol, but she began paying attention to different things. In meetings, she found herself listening longer before forming conclusions. She started reading the names on internal reports, not just the reports themselves, but the people behind them, the analysts and coordinators and operational staff, whose work fed into the documents that landed on her desk. She walked the floors of her company differently, not to inspect, but to observe the way someone moves through a space when they're trying to understand it, rather than manage it. There was a woman in the procurement division. Her name was Sandra Ortiz, and she had been with the company for 11 years, who had flagged a vendor pricing discrepancy in a quarterly report 2 years prior. Victoria had seen the flag at the time and passed it to Crane without noting who had raised it. She pulled the report now and found Sandra's name in the footer. She asked Crane about her. He said she was excellent, thorough, consistent, completely reliable. Victoria asked why Sandra hadn't been considered for the senior procurement role that had been filled 18 months ago. Crane said she hadn't been put forward. He didn't say why. Neither of them needed to. Victoria had a meeting with Sandra Ortiz the following week. It lasted 45 minutes and covered a range of procurement inefficiencies that Victoria had not previously known about, and should have. She left the meeting with 3 action items and the distinct and somewhat uncomfortable awareness that there were likely dozens of people inside her own company whose value she had been measuring by the wrong instruments for years. She didn't transform overnight. That was not how she worked, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. What she did was slower and more deliberate, a recalibration conducted the way you recalibrate something that has been accurate in most conditions, but has been consistently off in one specific area for so long that you stopped noticing the margin of error. She saw Daniel Brooks once more several months later. It was at a commercial development conference, the kind of event where the city's business community gathered in a large hotel ballroom to perform connectivity at each other. He was standing near one of the side exits, holding a glass of water. Not champagne. She almost smiled at that. He was watching the room with the same quality of attention she recognized by now, total unperforming contained. He saw her see him. He nodded once. She returned the nod. That was all. He didn't cross the room. She didn't cross the room. There was no reconciliation scene, no moment of mutual understanding wrapped in the kind of language that makes things feel resolved when they are simply continuing. He returned to whatever he had been observing. She returned to the conversation she had been in. The room went on around both of them, full of noise and ambition, and people reading each other in 10-second intervals, and acting accordingly. The difference was that Victoria knew now what that cost. She knew what you missed when you moved that fast and trusted only what was visible. She knew that the most consequential things in a room are often the ones standing quietly at the edge of it, not asking to be noticed, not requiring acknowledgement to remain exactly what they are. She had built her life on the assumption that she could see clearly, that her ability to read people and situations quickly was a form of precision, and it was in most cases. But precision applied to the wrong instrument produces confident errors. She had been confident. She had been wrong. And the man who had taught her that hadn't done it by confronting her, or punishing her, or making her feel the full weight of it publicly. He had simply continued to be exactly what he was in every room he entered, regardless of whether anyone in that room thought he belonged there. That she had come to understand was its own kind of power, the kind that didn't need a signal to security to hold its ground.